Hey guys, my name is Neil, and today I'm going to show you how I built this custom angled grain cutting board and how I put the spill groove in. So let's get started. I started with some maple I got from a local hardwood store. I set my miter gauge at 45 degrees and used a clamp to help hold it still, and this helped keep it from sliding. It took a minute to figure out the best way to make this cut, but this is what I came up with. I cut the board in half to make it a little easier to work with. Then I set my fence at 2 inches and made 6 cuts. I don't own a joiner, so I took the boards to my planer to give them smoother and straighter edges. A joiner would have made this a lot easier. Then I went to my miter saw to cut off the extra triangles on the ends of each board. I made sure not to cut off too much because I'll give the board a perfect edge on my table saw later. Then I laid out the strips. I had them numbered from the order I took them from the big board, and I grouped them in 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, 6. And then I took 4, put it between 1 and 2, 5 between 2 and 3, and 6 on the end. I noticed the boards had some slight gaps between them, so I laid out some 150 grit sandpaper flat on my workbench and did a little sanding on them. I even took a couple pieces back to my table saw and ripped the edges of them to make them straighter. Man, I wish I had that joiner. Then I laid everything out and got ready for the glue up. I put painter's tape on my clamps to protect them from any drips. I used Titebond 3, it's the best glue for cutting boards that I've found. It's waterproof and it's food safe. A day later I took it out of the clamps and went back to the planer. I used the locking bar on every pass just like the machine says, and it really seems to make a difference. Helps avoid snipe. And back to the table saw to give the board a clean edge. I just set my miter gauge on 90 and made a few rips. Next I just took a few measurements to figure out what size strips of rosewood I was going to need. I know the video is sped up, but I found that I really had to take my time making these cuts. That rosewood is some tough wood. Next I had everything laid out and got ready for the glue up. And I gave them a final sanding just to clear any burrs. Then I laid out my clamps and got ready for the glue up. Again I used Titebond 3. I don't really like these clamps, I wish I had some parallel bar clamps. You'll see here in a minute that they really flex, so I had to keep them flat and at this angle so they really didn't bow the board. Here you can see them flex, and when I moved it in it made it a little better, but still not great. But it's what I had and I made it work. A day later I took it out of the clamps and went back to the table saw to clean up the edges. And I checked to make sure I was still at 90. This Johnson digital level is a really handy tool in the shop. I just used my miter gauge again to keep the board square and just trimmed off the extra rosewood. Then I went to the sander to make sure the edges were flush. This will help keep it from grabbing the guides in my planer. Again, I use that locking bar for every pass, and always be sure to take your time when using a planer. And back to sanding. I like to use this big piece of canvas. It keeps the board from sliding around, and it protects it when I flip it over. I started with 120 grit and moved on to 240. This was just to give it a smooth surface for my router to slide on. I made a few marks for where I wanted my router to end for the spill groove. It came out to be about 7/8 of an inch from the edge. I made this handy little router guy out of some scrap 2x4s I had laying around that I ran through the planer and sanded smooth. It really helps when I make these spill grooves. Here I am just adjusting the depth on the router. I didn't like how shallow it was. I kept moving the guide to each side and finished out the spill groove. I always started where I left off on the last groove. Unfortunately, the router bit set I have is a pretty cheap one just from Lowe's, and it left quite a few burn marks, especially in that rosewood. So a lot of sanding later, I got them out of there. If anyone else has some other tips on how to avoid those burn marks, please let me know. Then I moved on to start final sanding, and here I am rounding over the edges with my orbital sander because I didn't want to use those router bits again and make more burn marks. This worked just fine and turned out very even. Here's an important step. It's called raising the grain. In between grits of sanding, I like to take a wet paper towel and wipe down the whole board. This raises those little bitty wood fibers you just flattened down with the sandpaper. It mimics the first washing of the board, so if you're giving this as a gift or selling it, after the first time they wash it, it won't turn up rough. I worked my way through grits of sandpaper. I started at 120, went to 240, and finished up at 320. In between all of them, I raised that grain and wet down the whole board. Here I'm using 220 grit sandpaper to get in the spill groove. I don't have an air compressor, so this microfiber towel picks up the dust out of that groove pretty well. After my final sanding, I noticed there was a lot of dust left in the corners of the spill groove. So I took a wet paper towel, wet it down, and then picked it up with the microfiber cloth. That really helped get the dust out. And now it was time for everyone's favorite part, putting the finish on. I used walrus cutting board oil. Be sure to follow the directions and make sure you shake it before using, and let it sit for 24 hours. But now I'll shut up so you can watch this grain come to life. Here's a tip I learned from Brandon at Walker's Woodworks. Store your foam brush in a ziploc bag and it'll stay good forever. I've been able to use that brush on quite a few cutting boards. After the walrus oil soaks in for 24 hours, I like to use Howard Butcher Block oil. I like to use a microfiber towel to help buff it in. It makes these cutting boards shine. The bottle recommends for new boards to do 3 coats 20 minutes apart, so that's exactly what I did. If you pay close attention in these next clips, you'll notice how the color of it really changes with this oil put on it. After that 3rd coat, wipe off the extra, and you're finished.
Alright guys, thanks for watching. Hopefully that was helpful. Any questions, leave them in the comments, and if you liked it, give me a thumbs up. And if you want more updates on projects like these rosewood knuckles I made, hit subscribe. Thank you.